And I think it's an important question because what we have seen is that Israel has this sort of impunity which it has enjoyed since its founding of its state. Just your take on that.
So I don't think the G20 particularly has a direct influence as one instrument of the international order. I think the international order is in crisis generally. So one did not need to wait for the G20. I mean, there's a whole range of other instruments that have not been used. So yes, of course, I think the point that we were discussing earlier, one would hope that powerful countries like the UK, France and other countries would rethink their supply of weapons to Israel. Now, whether or not that happens, I think is something that we'd have to wait and see, but you know, one's gut sense is it will not happen. Israel is a really strategic and important country yes. for these global north, well, not all of the global north, but certainly the US and the UK. Its position in the Middle East, the reason that this was created as a home, the kind of narrow Jewish religious nationalism that we're seeing, you know, all of this makes Israel a really strategic country for the West. So one would hope that countries in the G20 would apply pressure. We're likely to see that from countries like Indonesia, Turkey, and the countries we'd expect to see it from. We know Saudi Arabia is taking a nuanced position in the meeting with Trump last week. You know, there was this talk about Israel, but also about, you know, the rights of Palestinians.
You know, I want to ask Dr. Buccus of that because I watched that press conference with Mohammed bin Salman and Donald Trump. Is that what we're hearing from Saudi Arabia is that you need to recognize this two-state solution. You need Palestinians need to have their own state, and only then can the Abrahamic Accords occur. But let's call it for what it is, Dr. Buccus. The far right within that very same Israeli government is saying, no, it will not happen because we do not want to see this happen. We see Palestinians as subhuman. We see them as nothing short of being human beings. And we have seen that this far right, especially the likes of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich and Daniel Lavoie, saying, we will not accept a Palestinian state and we will continue this oppression of Palestinians, which for me really sees, I think, a testing of Muslim nations, number one, but especially that of the Gulf nations who are pushing for this two-state solution, but they still want to have this relationship with the United States of America.
So I think several points, right? One is, this is like having the AWB on steroids in power.
I think so, yeah.
So it's a troubling moment for the world, particularly the Palestinians. The other point is governments don't stay in power forever. This Israeli coalition government has a whole range of problems, and it could implode. I don't think we'd get an ideal Israeli government, but you could likely get a government that's less right-wing, less rabid as this one. Israel is highly reliant on the US for its funding, for its military, for its survival. So the US has that trump card. Saudi Arabia is an important country for the US. In military terms, in terms of being a wealthy country, in terms of Iran, you know. So I think these machinations impact on this right-wing view that the Israeli administration would have currently. Talking about these Muslim nations, I think one we know is there isn't a homogenized construction of these Muslim nations. They're all so different. You have ideological fractions within them. You have, Iran, and then you have Saudi Arabia, and then you have other countries that, would take completely different positions. One would often be critical of Iran and its position, and one would often be critical of Saudi, and each of these nations, I think the fundamental point to remember is that they act in their national interest. Their foreign policy and what they do is not based on what happens in Palestine, right? It's based on their own interest.
So I think that for me is where, Dr. Buccus, I think the viewer needs to understand. Reading the other questions, what is the point of all of these summits when, unfortunately, It can't stop the bombing and the genocide happening in Gaza. And off air, you were telling me that this is just the international political framework. A summit like this is not going to pick up the phone and tell Benjamin Netanyahu, hey, you violated a ceasefire, stop it. Because if an ICJ recommendation can't say that, then I honestly don't see a G20 recommendation telling him, listen, you've got to stop the bombing. He doesn't care what international institutions think. And that's just the way it has played out for itself.
Absolutely. Coming back to this point that the international system is in crisis. You know, this idea of international law that we all look up to and hope that it would help. But who came up with the international system post-World War II? Led by countries like the US. Who's rejecting the international system now? It's countries like the US. This idea of trade and tariffs. It was the US and international financial institutions said free market, reduction in import tariffs. The US is doing the exact opposite. So all of these deep ironies impact what's happening today. I think, you know, the position that South Africa took at the ICJ is significant. People also ask questions about what will we see? You know, will Netanyahu be arrested? Whether or not he'll be arrested, you know, time will tell. But these are important political statements. It fractures, it punctures the position of Israel in the world. You know, but if one thinks that having the G20 is now going to impact on what's happening in Gaza directly, it's not.
There can be discussions about it, and I think President Ramaphosa has spoken, but like you said, Dr. Buccus, a simple phone call to Netanyahu in Tel Aviv is not going to tell him, stop it, because Israel's mind is made up. They want to ethnically cleanse the Palestinians in Gaza and the occupied West Bank. And the world is just watching. And again, like you mentioned, the G20 can't really do much about it.
One of the first points that he made, President Ramaphosa made in his speech, was the interconnectedness of the world. But that interconnectedness is not cohesive. You know, yes, we're talking about countries are interconnected. What happens in the north, global north, affects us. What happens here affects them. But our positioning is just so far apart. The US disagrees on addressing pandemics. The US disagrees on just so many other things at the G20. Saying to South Africa, you can't have a declaration. No low-level handover. So we're just too far apart. You know, so I don't know how interconnectedness is going to help. I don't think interconnectedness even has as substantial an impact on what we're talking about the Middle East. Yes, it can help. Countries will come together. But I think countries of the global north have a position on the Middle East that perhaps becomes less radical, but certainly is not going to change too much.
We are going to, in our second session, going to touch on Europe and its role within the global aspect of things. Another question that came up was, of course, you know, what is the G20? Well, of course, it's a group of 20 countries coming together. It was founded after the financial crisis to go ahead and really discuss you know, how the world needs to reshape itself economically and politically. Dr. Buccus, let's get down to President Ramaphosa's speech. He's done many of this, I think, since he took over in the union buildings back in February 2018. Just before we break down everything, your initial reaction to the president's speech, Dr. Buccus?
You know, knowing how Ramaphosa approaches these summits, knowing his art of diplomacy, knowing some of the people he has in his back office, it came as no surprise. But you know, when one thinks about the bigger picture of the G20, decisions taken here are not binding, they're not legally binding. Of course, countries can choose to abide by what they deem fit. But he made some really important points. I'd want to start with, yes, he spoke about interconnectedness, and then he went on to talk about poverty and inequality. You know, we are by far the most unequal society in the world. You know, Gini coefficient, the measure of inequality, is the largest in South Africa. When you think about one landing in our country and coming to OR Tambo and then taking the Gautrain and getting off in Sandton, one would think that this is a fabulously wealthy country. But of course, we all know that when you are in Sandton and you crane your neck and look over, you see Alex Township. So this constant juxtaposition of extreme wealth and poverty. And I think it was important that Ramaphosa made that point, because we often talk about perhaps the poverty gap, lessening in some countries, but certainly inequality is growing. And what is inequality linked to? It's linked to these exact international systems, the IMF and the World Bank. Which brings us to the point about one of the other things he talks about, which is the restructuring of the IMF and the World Bank. It comes out of the post-World War II context, wanting to rebuild the world after the war. The Washington consensus comes into being. But what it does ultimately, it hurts poorer countries more than it should be helping.
You know what's surprising in all of this, Dr. Buccus? Let's look at, for example, post-colonial Africa. We have leaders that come out of liberation movements. Some of them are not dealing with the domestic issues in a way that it was supposed to be dealt with. Let's take a look, for example, with East Africa. We take Idi Amin and what had happened there. You look at Nigeria and the certain civil wars that had happened there. You look at, of course, Zimbabwe, and when sanctions were then put on them, of course, 20 years into Robert Mugabe's presidency. And then when this financial crisis happens, those very same governments go to the World Bank or the IMF and ask for loans, and it indebts the countries even more. South Africa has gone into asking for loans by the IMF and the World Bank.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the debt restructuring, especially for African countries, one of the recommendations we are going to see is that obviously you can't eliminate the debt. I don't think any financial institution is just going to say, okay, it's fine, we're going to eliminate the debt. That's not going to happen. But a partial sort of consensus or concessions with regards to that. Your take on that, Dr. Buccus? Can we see that actually happening? Yeah. Is there an appetite for that to occur, especially on those board of directors sitting in these institutions?
If you don't mind, Faraz, let me give you a kind of lengthy framing.
Sure, no problem.
You started by talking about liberation movements, and that's really important. So let's take South Africa and its relationship with this debt. South Africa, the liberation movement, or the ANC, comes into power in '94. It's faced with a huge crisis. It has odious debt. Debt incurred by the apartheid state to oppress and kill liberation movement people is now being used as debt that they now have to repay. So that's the one irony. Mandela comes into power, and we realize that, of course, we know that we had a country that was there just for a small minority of white people. Now you have masses of people, and the posters in '94 were saying land, jobs, houses.
Yeah, I remember it, even though as a very, very young boy, I remember it quite clearly. Yeah.
And you had people saying Pretoria will deliver. This is, our lives are going to change. This is the end of poverty. This is the end of homelessness, etc. Mandela has a crisis. What do? You have these high expectations. You also have a negotiated settlement. Bourgeois democracy, if you like. You want to appease white business. They don't want, things to just be upset. You want to protect white capital, and you want to appease the black masses. What do? You have Thabo Mbeki as one of the leaders, deputy president, economist, trained in Sussex, very suave intellectually. Go to the IMF and the World Bank. And if I can just be very pedestrian and simplistic about this, the IMF will say, sure, we'll give you the money. But we'll give you the money on condition you sign on the dotted line. And what does the dotted line mean? Privatization, cut down in social expenditure, reduction in import tariffs. We can talk for an hour about each of them, but they have a devastating impact. Right?
Did the government at the time, and I know we're focusing obviously on a global perspective, but it's important to take it from a South African perspective. What's the foresight from the government? So you're mentioning Thabo Mbeki going to these financial institutions asking for loans, and they're not just going to willy-nilly give it. A lot of it is attached to the state-owned enterprises, as you're mentioning, and key institutions within the country. Was there foresight in your view, Dr. Buccus, that this was going to be the situation? And of course we have the years of Zuma, which of course what we saw within many of those state-owned entities. I wanted to get your take on it, because it really has such a domino effect with just that one meeting that Thabo Mbeki has with these financial institutions.
One might need to quote Karl Marx here, right?
Yeah, definitely.
You know, one of the statements he makes was, men make history, but not in context of their choosing. You have a neoliberal order taking over the world. Mandela acknowledges that I don't fully understand this. I've been in prison for 27 years. I have a deputy president who's an economist, trained economist. Who am I to be talking about this? I defer to him. And of course Mbeki said we have to go this route. Mandela is on television in 1996 and he makes the statement that globalization and GEAR, the growth, employment and redistribution policy, he says in very strong terms, it's not negotiable. And I think that's what they call the class suicide project. And I think that upsets the left. And they say, how can Mandela be saying this? When you listen to young people today at university, young people in their 20s, you'd sometimes hear them say Mandela was a sellout. And you sit back and say, how on earth can you say that? You know, each generation has its own struggles, has its own focus. The reason perhaps they're saying that is we've waited 30 years. You've told us about this liberation movement, democracy. I still don't have a house. I still don't have, well, perhaps lesser water and electricity, but I don't have sanitation. Very little has changed for me. And then some of them will go back to 96 and say, well, in part, Mandela had a role in this by choosing globalization, by choosing this neoliberal order. But coming back to this idea that men make history, but not in context of their choosing. Did they give it thought? I think so, maybe not enough. But they had to go to the World Bank and the IMF. You want to build a country. You have, and I don't want to get too technical about this, but you had political democratization, right? We got a democracy, an imperfect one, a negotiated one. But then you also had what was happening on the international scene, economic liberalization. You know, World Bank and the IMF taking over. And when you have what we call the intersection of this democratization with liberalization, it hugely impacts the capacity of the state to deliver. And I think we saw that. If you take the period 1996 to 2000, the height of neoliberalism, we lost 1 million jobs, we had 2 million evictions, and we had 10 million people who had either their water or electricity cut off. Because if you think back to that era, we were talking about water and electricity as commodities. The state was talking about our clients. Yes, you can talk about that in the US, but in South Africa, we think less so of electricity and water being commodities.
Well, now I mean, when you think about it, I know we've come out of load shedding, Dr. Buccus, but now it's coming to a point where it's, if I'm going to get it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, that's just where we are right now within this contextualization of it. And again, Dr. Buccus, it just comes down to the talk of global financial institutions, because I don't think we're alone. I think as South Africans, we're slightly better. But from an African perspective, Dr. Buccus, it kind of feels difficult for the rest of the continent to have those human or basic human necessities. And I'm hoping, and I want to get your take on this, that somehow this can be addressed during this G20 summit.
Yeah, talking about people now not having water and electricity and being really upset about that, I think has less to do with this neoliberal order that we're talking about. In large part, it has to do with the government of the day. Incapacity, the extent to which they invested in maintaining infrastructure, etc. We simply can't just blame the past for that. I think our government has made huge mistakes. And that impacts young people. You tell us that we have this fabulous constitution, it's really progressive, and young people might say, so what? I've heard the people say, well, why are you telling me about this fabulous constitution? I can't eat the constitution. I have bread and butter issues. So I think that's where we're failing. But listen, it's the nature of liberation movements. It's not just South Africa. And if you want me to,
let's look at our northern neighbors, Zimbabwe.
Yeah.
I mean, I would like to think their current situation really is one where you need to look at how the constitution, how democracy has been completely eroded right over there. And you see the migration happening, whether it's legally or illegally. That border crossing that is happening in Limpopo shows just how much of poverty has occurred in that country. And there's your example there. The ZANU-PF did what it could to get the British Empire out. But now look at it. It is become a sign of distastefulness and a sign of oppression in the eyes of many Zimbabweans right now.
So like we were saying, it's not just South Africa, it's not just Zimbabwe. Later on, if we have the chance, I'd like to talk about each of these countries in Southern Africa. But what is it about liberation movements? There's a whole lot of literature now about that. Yes, they come into power, we're all in awe, like we remember the ANC. But if you look at the continent, liberation movements tend to get pushed to the periphery. 3, 4, 5 decades into power. Why do they get pushed to the periphery? We know the answers, we're seeing it. Infighting and mainly corruption, right? This desire for power, right? And we're seeing that within the ANC. We don't have one ANC, we have multiple ANCs.
Well, some have morphed into the MK party.
That's the other point, right?
Yeah, exactly.
You have iterations of the ANC, EFF, MK, and then you had COPE.
Yeah, you had COPE, yes,
All of these are the ANC, or is the ANC, but different iterations of it. So liberation movements are imperfect. They do get pushed to the periphery. And then the question that some academics have been asking, and there's this big analyst, big name in political science called Frantz Fanon, who was writing in the 60s. And if you read his work now, you'd think he's looking at the South African news, right? But he's writing in the 60s. And one of the things he questions is whether liberation movements are the ideal force to govern after liberation. And he calls that into question. And he says what often happens as to liberation movements is they're not prepared to govern, right? And he says that they want to mimic the colonizer. They want the BMW and they want all of the fanciful things that come with it, and they want it today. And the reason they want it today is, the argument is, we've been robbed for decades, for centuries, it's our time, so we want it. So the state becomes the quickest facilitator of social mobility. I want that latest iPhone. How am I going to get it? Or the latest BM on the house in the suburbs is if I steal from the state. Right? And we saw that, and we're seeing that across the continent. What happens in the global north? The US, the UK. Young people aspire to property markets, they aspire to, the Wall Street, the London Stock Exchange, etc. Young people on the African continent aspire to the state. We want to be in government. They don't come from a history of wealth. Very often they first generation university, first generation business, and the state is that facilitator. We need access to the state in order to move on in life, and I think that becomes a huge problem.
Dr. Buccus, I want to just touch on President Ramaphosa's speech. Of course, we've spoken about the global inclusive growth, I want to touch on multilateralism. It's been a discussion, especially since the formation of BRICS, which I think has come in and disrupt the natural order of global economic, a global political outlook, I beg your pardon, because I really do feel that the West and the global North have been shook by what we have seen within BRICS. Multilateralism. The global South wants to play ball. It's quite clear. Since, of course, Indonesia took over was the first global South leader, and then, of course, it went to India, then to Brazil, and now in South Africa. This discussion of multilateralism has been a dominant theme. Where do you see this? Because President Ramaphosa is quite convinced that multilateralism has to be the order of the day.
Yeah, of course. Let's go back to BRICS. You know, BRICS emerges as a force of the global South. It's not an organization. It's a coming together of powers. In simple words, it's a power block, if you like. The last time, one of the most significant times historically that we saw countries come together was in '55. You had the Bandung Conference, the coming together of the non-aligned movement. The ANC was represented, not the government of the day, and you had countries asserting themselves, right? Which we can talk about China later on, because China's role in Africa starts at that point. But let's talk about BRICS. BRICS emerges in 2009 in the aftermath of the financial crisis, and it's about restructuring financial systems, it's about development, etc. South Africa is a late entrant, 2010. So it's a powerful group of countries. If you think about the economy of the US, 26 trillion, followed by China, which is about 20 trillion, some people say. And then if you think about us, just 500 billion, and then you think about countries like India, China, we said China was about 20 trillion, but India is not yet at the 5 trillion mark, right? But the coming together of these countries is powerful. It challenges the global North, and it indicates that in many ways it's the time of the global South, right? Well, I could take that point forward, but
I mean, there's something there, and within the G20 nations itself. Look at the amount of representation that is in there from the BRICS countries: China, Russia, India, Brazil, and of course now South Africa that has come in. And then, of course, 2 years ago, when more nations were added to it, when South Africa hosted the BRICS conference, Dr. Buccus, you had, of course, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, two key players within, of course, the Gulf states. Of course, Argentina were there, but when Javier Milei came into power, of course, he's just swayed away from it. But I do feel that when you look at the outlook of BRICS, of course, United Arab Emirates was just invited as a guest to this, but the fact that Saudi Arabia is there, there's an influence of BRICS within this G20, isn't it? And I think it kind of puts into perspective that sooner or later, if it's not going to be at this summit, in later summits, the global North will have to somehow accept multilateralism as the order of the day. Your take on that, Dr. Buccus?
No, certainly. And one of the most powerful forces is BRICS, right? There are huge fractures within BRICS. They're not a group of united countries that have come together, but they're coming together to disrupt the power of the global North. India and China, huge problems. From the Dalai Lama to border issues, etc. We've seen that over decades. Iran and Saudi Arabia, ideological differences in terms of the global order. Ethiopia and Egypt, over the Nile, and a whole number of other issues. So each of these countries have issues with each other and amongst one another. So that is a problem. But there is a bigger picture, and that bigger picture is we come together in order to disrupt power. We come together in order to think about a BRICS bank, a new development bank That's critical. It disrupts the IMF and the World Bank. Does it come with its own conditionalities?
Yeah.
Yes. What are they? We don't know exactly. We know what the conditionalities of the IMF and the World Bank are. The BRICS Bank or the New Development Bank has already helped us in the context of the pandemic, in the context of ESCOM, in the context of other state utilities. So it is the time of the Global South. You're seeing the strengthening of BRICS. You're seeing ASEAN coming across as a more powerful bloc. And you're seeing the moral authority of the West being questioned. And again, if you come back to Gaza, I think, it's played a critical role in questioning the moral authority of the West.
Yeah, I mean, you've seen the Security Council. Of course, the makeup of the Security Council, it just takes a veto ruling from one of the 5 within the Security Council to go ahead and, of course, disrupt it. I mean, 6 times, if I stand to be corrected, the US has vetoed a ceasefire in Gaza, which, of course, have a legal binding implementation to it because it came from the United Nations. That, for me, and I want to touch on this, Dr. Buccus, because President Ramaphosa, throughout this entire G20 presidency, has spoken about more representation from African countries within the Security Council. I think what the challenge is going to come is that as long as the United States is there vetoing certain resolutions, like what we're seeing in Gaza right now, rests on the United States. And unfortunately, the makeup of how Security Council veto powers work is going to remain the same. And the United States is going to enforce on that, because when you listen, especially this year or during the presidency or the second presidency of Donald Trump, I beg your pardon, he's quite hesitant, or he's quite nonchalant on the way the United Nations works. That's a worry.
It's certainly a worry. Of course, the Security Council, is out of the machinations of the world order. But one struggles to understand how multiple years later you have these countries that dictate to the world. You have a continent where its population is going to double in the next few years, decade or so. It's going to be a increasingly powerful part of the world. No representation, right? And I think that plays into this idea that human rights is being used to assert power, right? And we've seen how this nice talk about human rights is often there to assert power. It's human rights when it suits the West. There's no genocide
Ukraine
in Gaza.
being a classic example. We're going to touch on that a bit. But I mean, there's your example right over there. It's laughable, but sad at the same time, Dr. Buccus.
Yeah, because, a narrative of human rights that suits the West is what applies. Algeria, historically, and the Salvation Front, it didn't suit. You think about the election in Gaza, and it didn't suit the US, and in multiple other countries. So human rights is being used as an instrument of power. But can human rights be used as an instrument of resistance? Yes, it can. And who's shown that to the world? We're a proud country. We have, right, with the ICJ case. We took the idea of human rights and we said, well, you can't always hold us to account. Here we'll hold you to account. You can't just talk about Umar al-Bashir and other countries in Africa and bring us to the court. We want you to come to the court, right? Historically, we ask questions about, why is Tony Blair and why is George Bush not at the court for the massacring of people in Iraq and Afghanistan? And we often told, no, some of these countries are not signatories to the Rome Statute. Why not? Why not the pressure on them? Why the pressure on us? Because we're the victims, right? Yes. You need to be a signatory in order to, benefit from this, that, or the other. And that's the point I'm making, is that human rights is being used as an instrument to concretize power. And that's a huge, huge problem.
But right? That, again, is the issue. And I want to come to this, the Ukraine-Russia war that we're currently having at this moment. the amount of pressure that the European Union put on Russia, and look, rightfully so, because if you look at obviously the context of the invasion, there is a brutality to it, but of course there's other aspects to it. Of course, areas which Ukraine had obviously seized, which was against the agreement of them being part of NATO, or them potentially joining NATO. There, of course, was that. But the way the European Union had the sanctions on Russia, and this happened within a space of days, weeks. But here we are, 2 years into a genocide in Gaza, Dr. Buccus, and yet till today, a simple request from the United Kingdom and France, who are of course Security Council members, they still can't do the simple thing of saying we're going to suspend arms trade to Israel. Suspend arms trade. It's not completely banned. We're asking for the minimal of this, and yet these nations, who of course sit as G20 nations, can't even do that. I think it's hypocrisy at the highest, and unfortunately the world is seeing it for what it is right now.
You know, the decisions made by these countries in the West when it comes to Israel comes as no surprise. I think we too historically have been victims. It was these very same countries, or some of them at least, that supplied weapons to the apartheid state. It was the Israelis who helped the apartheid state. It was the US, it was multiple other countries. And the US was on the side of apartheid. During the Reagan administration, Thatcher in the UK was the one who questioned whether Mandela should be released. The US only changes tact in 1986. They had this comprehensive anti-apartheid act, vetoed by Reagan, by the way. And it was the only time at that point that a decision vetoed was overrun, right? And they started to implement sanctions, etc. So the point I'm making is the positions we're seeing on Israel are not surprising. You know, these are the machinations of world politics.
This is history repeating itself, because as you mentioned,
Yes.
the Reagan veto, and now we've got the Biden and the Trump administration vetoes that are playing right in front of us, and quite clearly.
Yeah, they are. And I think that brings us back to instruments like BRICS, like ASEAN, like other global instruments that emerge from the global south. I think, there's this great analyst called Wada Khanfa who writes a lot about this. You know, he's been involved in Al Jazeera and involved now in the Middle East. And he talks clearly about the power of the global north diminishing, right? And there's a huge linkage to what's happening in the Middle East. So, we're seeing that with countries in Asia, we're seeing that with other countries. Of course, we're unlikely to see that with India, because India India has a proud history of supporting South Africa. The Congress Party in the 40s, and then later on coming to power, is on the side of the anti-apartheid movement. And then now you have a complete swing, complete right-wing BJP. Right?
And not just right-wing. I think they're so aggressive in their policies.
Yeah.
They're so fanatical in the way they do things. I mean, I know we're going to touch on that later on, but I mean, what we're seeing right now is just a change in the way governments are doing it. And India, for the power that it holds within the world, I mean, that really sets quite a dangerous precedent.
Yeah. India was one of the first countries to reject apartheid, to come out on the side of the anti-apartheid movement. And of course, there's a long history between Congress and the ANC. And today you're seeing a toxic right-wing leader who of course is here with us in Johannesburg. You had the Gujarat massacre in 2002. You have Kashmir recently. And what is the point of saying all of this? There's a linkage to Israel. And that linkage to Israel is you have Hindu nationalism, which is insular, in a country that claims to be secular and to be one of the largest democracies. And Israel is also, Jewish nationalism.
And they claim they're the only democracy in the Middle East.
And the problem with these nationalisms is that they're really insular. They're not embracing. Modi might talk about our democracy is embracing, we have a couple of hundred Muslims, a couple of 100 million Muslims, and it's embracing, but like we know, it's not. It's anything but embracing. And that's that doctrine of narrow nationalisms, which of course we're seeing in South Africa too, in a completely different way. You know.
Dr. Buccus, let's, another part of what President Ramaphosa, and of course we are getting closer towards the end of our first session. We've got about 15 minutes.
Which is a welcome thing.
Definitely. I think we've been going 2 hours straight. So you've got 15 minutes. I want to touch on global economic growth. Inclusive economic growth. I attended the B20 summit this week. And the discussions I've been having with various discussions from the business community, not just from South Africa, but outside of it, is that there has to be this global economic growth. There has to be the sense of finding a way so that the global South can sit on the same table as the global North. And President Ramaphosa has mentioned that within his opening speech. A lot of it's going to come down to what the global North does, doesn't it?
Unfortunately, it all comes back to the global North, right? When you live in a world dictated by the logic of capital, when countries would do anything, we've seen that historically with oil in Iraq and in other parts of the Middle East. We can destroy people, we can destroy lives because we want the oil. How do you talk about inclusive growth today when, and there are multiple dimensions to it, when the focus in the world now is not oil? You know, oil is a thing of the past in multiple ways. The focus today is on critical minerals. There's these 50 minerals that the US needs for its immediate prosperity. It's 100% dependent for 12 of those minerals on other countries. It's at least 50% dependent for close to 30 of those minerals. Those inclusive growth is impacted by that. Beneficiation, what we have the world's platinum, 60-70% of it. We don't benefit from it, right? He imposes tariffs, but not on the platinum, because it suits the US. And we can talk about all the other.
You know what's interesting about, I want to bring platinum because lest we forget Marikana in 2012.
Yes.
And I think for me, there was a chance for the communities to benefit out of this. So my take on this, Dr. Buccus, is that if we're going to have inclusive economic growth, the actual communities that are needing to benefit from this are not benefiting from this. Marikana is a classic example. Even now, when you hear the likes of Neil Froneman, as of course Sibanye Stillwater, of course, took over as Lonman, as this holding company within that, when you see the astronomical amount that he earns as a CEO, I'm thinking, how can you have economic inclusive growth when conglomerates and multinationals make decisions which quite clearly is not in the interest of the communities that are involved in the mine?
No, they're not. And again, it's not surprising, right? Who do the minerals benefit in each of these countries? Take our neighbor, Mozambique. The discovery of gas in the north. Hundreds of millions of dollars. Who does it benefit? Paris, for one, with Total, but also the super elite of Mozambique. They talk about having the sovereignty fund, and money goes into the sovereignty fund, and part of it goes to the government, and part of it is used for development. The problem is the money that goes into the sovereignty fund and goes to government, there will be corruption with Frelimo. And that's the huge problem. How do you have growth? How do you have masses of people benefiting when it's just the elite that benefit from the discovery of minerals? And Mozambique is a good example. The other thing with Mozambique is it has the world's graphite. right? That you need
And that's
around
just
the
not,
world.
and that's just not. You mentioned gas, but you've added something else, graphite, which is
Yeah.
in the modern era of technology, especially with its smartphones or anything else, graphite has become quite a huge mineral in terms of that.
And that's the reason you're seeing the US being in Mozambique more and more. You had President Chapo going to Washington and meeting J.D. Vance not too long ago. You suddenly have the US talking about Mozambique as this great country, this great partner. Of course, it's political
Not
opportunism.
without coincidence. Yeah.
Not coincidence. This is the same country that funded Renamo in the 80s. This is the same country, and apartheid South Africa, of course, that enabled the killing of hundreds of thousands of Mozambicans. Now suddenly Mozambique is a great country because they have graphite, because they have the gas. They're talking about buying the graphite from other countries and companies from Australia in order to prevent China from benefiting. That's the new Cold War, if you like. So, ultimately the point is minerals don't benefit people of the country. They benefit other countries and they benefit the elite, which of course is a huge problem.
And I think that, Dr. Buccus, is kind of the head scratcher in all of this. If we're having this talk of global inclusivity, global economic inclusivity, but the very same nations that are sitting on the table are not really coming to the party and saying, okay, we're actually going to go ahead and take charge of this to try and find a way to happen. Meanwhile, the conglomerates which operates in their country are showing something different. Let's, for example, take South Africa when Shell wanted to do some excavations for gas within the West Coast. It really did it in a way which ignored the environmental aspects of it.
Yeah.
And this is my sort of sharp criticism of government. It kind of felt as if the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy kind of said, okay, go ahead and do it. So I think as much as the discussion looks like from a global perspective, there has to be a domestic magnifying glass view of this, is that if we are allowing this to happen without it following mandates and rules and regulations, then it kind of defeats the purpose, doesn't it?
Yeah, but decisions that governments make often have less to do with morality. They have less to do with whether it's going to benefit, perhaps whether it's going to benefit, but governments act in their national interest. So if they make decisions that counter progress we're making in terms of addressing climate issues, but if it's going to mean huge benefits financially from these global conglomerates, then the decision might go the other way. Like in Mozambique, where other countries, the US, France, etc., are benefiting more than perhaps even Mozambicans. And again, that's about, the national interest in inverted commas, because it's suiting the elite but not suiting the people of Mozambique. So it's all about the national interest. It's all of that informs how decisions are made.
And therein lies, I think, the challenge. Let's take a look at the 20 countries that are there. It's quite clear that within themselves they're going to say it's in the national interest of our economy, and they're not going to allow this mandate or this discussion, or if it ends up becoming a recommendation. And again, for the viewer out there, this is not a legally binding decisions that come out from the G20. If the consensus is that we want this global economic inclusivity, there are nations there, none more so than the United States of America, who of course we don't know if that junior representative that they've been talking about is actually going to come. Whether they're actually going to say, well, maybe we will adopt it, because none more so than the Trump administration sees itself as wanting to make it the MAGA movement, make America great again and America first. Some might argue that's probably a false, because it seems as if Israel dominates the global or the domestic affairs of the United States more than that of the American ones. But there are countries within the G20, as you've mentioned, Dr. Buccus, that are acting in their national interest, which I think puts a huge question mark on whether global economic growth will actually happen.
Well, yeah, it's all countries that act in their national interests, right? And I think, the G20 doesn't come together that necessarily thinks cohesively about all of these countries and all of the countries in the global south. They all have their own interest. It's also interesting about the nature of government. Yes, you have a Trump administration now that will last, another few years, and then you have another administration that will come into power, provided you don't have Trumpism continuing, well, hopefully not, and then you could have a reversal of decisions on climate change, of decisions being made in the global south, etc. So I think that's the one point, that politics is fluid, right? When we think about the G20, there's been not a rejection of South Africa, but I think in some ways a calling into question of the G20 itself. I mean, we sit here for, two days or more, deliberating, having early mornings and late nights here, and hoping we come out with the declaration. In all likelihood, we won't. Whatever we come out with is meant to be carried forward. And hopefully we'll have global south priorities centered. But what happens next year when you go to Florida for the G20?
And
global north priorities are going to be centered.
But that's the thing, because I kind of feel there's a futility about this. You're going to have these recommendations coming. Let's just say that the recommendations are really in the interest of the global south, and that there is a push to allow the global south to have this economic inclusivity. Donald Trump in Miami will look at the book, brush through it, tear it up and say, well, it's global north priorities. And that's the concern, that really should emanate from all of this.
Yeah, while we can't homogenize the global north, but certainly you're right, Trump will center the interests of the global north. And what happens to the G20 in subsequent years? For the foreseeable future, the G20 is going to be in the global north. The time of Brazil, Indonesia, etc., India is over. We are likely to see, after this G20, the G20 in the global north. Well, not likely, but we know that. And I think, but I think obviously these global north priorities are going to take center stage.
I definitely think so. Look, we've got just about 1.5 minutes, Dr. Buccus. To wrap up the first session, we've got President Ramaphosa, of course, giving his opening speech. What has been said now, there are going to be these closed sessions that are going to occur. I think this is a huge litmus test for the international community, isn't it? 1 minute, 20 seconds, Dr. Buccus, to wrap things up.
No, it is a litmus test. I think South Africa being in the eye of the storm is, a significant test for South Africa. It's taken a position that really interrupts the power of the global north. And I think we can sit here and be proud, despite our domestic issues, that we are big hitters on the international stage. We certainly punch above our weight. And I think that goes back to the Mandela era. Of course, it was the romance of the Mandela era. It was the Mandela magic. But even during the Mbeki era, you had, the affirming, the reassertion of Africa with the African Union, with NEPAD, with South Africa's role in the Security Council. So all of this placed South Africa center stage. Of course, in the Zuma administration, one is it might be 9 wasted years, but you also had in the Zuma administration BRICS, so we can't forget about that. So I think South Africa, signifies hope for the global south particularly, and hopefully that will continue and will continue to play this role. I think what is going to impact that role is that when you talk to people about South Africa playing this significant role, they're going to come back and tell you, but look what's happening across the road. and that's a huge problem. So I think the government of the day needs to do a lot more. Like they've cleaned up Johannesburg over the last few weeks, they have the capacity, it can be done. Corruption needs to be addressed, prosecutions need to be increased, and hopefully, that will help South Africa asserting its moral authority in a more concrete way.
Dr. Buccus, shukran so much for joining us for the first session. Our second session, of course, will start later on during the day, of course, and we will be continuing conversations. We still haven't touched on the Russia-Ukraine war in South Africa as being the honest broker, the SADC missions, but of course we're going to be touching on the rise of the far right in Europe, global solidarity and multilateralism's challenges, and of course the potential risk of modern day authoritarianism. This is Mzansi Welcomes the World. This is the completion of session 1 of our broadcast here on Hilal TV. Do stay tuned to us here on Hilal TV, DSTV channel 347 as we bring you coverage of day 1 of the G20 Leaders Summit from Nazareth.